in linkage with what we have been talking, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Lyla Latif to talk about the factors, economic factors and legislative elements that caused the presentation or the involvement of this issue to launch taxation and levy taxation on the digital world. Welcome aboard, Dr. Laila. Here we ask about the frameworks and the attempts internationally and nationally, particularly at the African level, that attempt to resolve this issue related to the digital sector, and how effective is it? Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sahar and audience. It's really amazing to be at this particular forum to discuss this very important question that Sahar has asked me on, like what are we really doing in terms of thinking about how are we going to be taxing the digital economy? What are the approaches that many countries have taken? Where are the pitfalls? And of course, where do we go from here in terms of the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation? So generally, the topic I want to touch on is taxing the digital economy. And the broader question is, how are we taxing this digital economy? And there are several proposals that are out there. The majority one is basically the Pillar 1 approach, which is the OECD recommended proposal on how countries should come up together as a consensus to think about taxing digital business models, many of them of which are in the United States and also China. But we're also seeing that the OECD Pillar 1 approach, it has actually stalled. And many countries have therefore, taken the next step of introducing unilateral measures. Common among them happens to be the digital service tax. But there are also questions coming out now that if we think about pushing ahead with Pillar 1, if the US decides to, come back into the discussion on Pillar 1 and say Pillar 1 now becomes a reality, what happens to digital service taxes? Do we repeal them, or do we come up with a mixed model where those countries that may not benefit a lot from the application of Pillar 1 can still go ahead and tax most of these multinational corporations on the basis of DST? So we need to also think about a mixed approach towards taxing the digital economy. And the broader question is, us as Africans, do we really get to pick? Do we get to decide how we're going to change the international tax norms when it comes to taxing the digital economy? So broadly, the question starts with, why is this discussion important for us? It is important because it concerns revenue mobilization from businesses that have entered the digital economy. You see, everything is digital today. Businesses do not need physical location to provide services. Automation has resulted in the provision of digital services from various geographical locations. One just needs the internet, a laptop, or a phone to access platforms where they can trade, they can consume social media, and also advertise their businesses. Now, the problem is that foreign multinational corporations have entered markets making incredible profits, but they are not liable to pay taxes in these market jurisdictions where their customers and users are based. So the problem is that the outdated colonial-faced approach to taxing business income, especially where the company is foreign, that happens to be the problem around the way in which we're not really getting to see how we can tax the digital economy, because the rules on who gets to tax business income happen to be outlined in tax treaties. So there is the OECD Model Convention on the Elimination of Double Taxation, which has always maintained the residence rule. And this rule simply means that business income should be taxed where the corporation is resident. Now, the residence rule does not care about where the real activity is taking place. So the source rule is limited by the OECD. When you look at Article 7 of the OECD Model Convention, which is on the right to tax business income, and Article 12, which is on taxing royalties, the norm here is that the resident state taxes, but the source state can only tax the multinational corporation if the requirement of a permanent establishment threshold is actually met. So this threshold, the permanent establishment, it requires a fixed place of business, a physical location. Now, the digital economy has made this permanent establishment threshold redundant. So the question is, how do we reallocate taxing rights in the absence of the permanent establishment threshold? So what we have is the OECD BEPS Pillar 1 approach, which is the approach. Now, this pillar, it proposes a formula. What it does is that it proposes a threshold, and there are three thresholds from what you will see, right? The first threshold is that the multinational corporations that are to be covered under Pillar 1 are only those whose revenue will hit 20 billion euros. The second threshold is that they must have a 10% profitability. And the third threshold is that only 25% of their residual profits will be subject to tax by market jurisdictions. That's actually quite rubbish if you really think of it in terms of how much really is subject to taxation by developing countries. Now, the formula, right, to now think about which country will be able to take up part of this 25% is set out as either amount, sorry, not either, but as amount A and amount B. So amount A is more of determining how to allocate the residual profit to market jurisdictions. And the proposal is to divide the 25% of residual profits into 4 categories. So you'll have payroll, which will take up 12.5%, employees, 12.5%, tangible assets at 25%, and sales, which includes customers and users, taking the largest share, which is 50%. Now, amount B is on the transfer pricing methodology. The 25%, now the residual that we're talking about as the third threshold. Now, this 25% is further subject to be reduced based on something that the OECD introduced as a safe harbor. So we've got this marketing and distribution safe harbor rules, which means there will still be some money, some revenue, income, profits that have to be deducted out of the 25% residue before market jurisdictions can access that money in the first place. So basically, the profits that can be taxed by market jurisdiction become very, very minimal. Now, for Pillar 1, it will require a multilateral treaty for implementation, and the US has already resisted because it sees Pillar 1 as mostly targeting US firms. Now we have Brazil, Colombia, India. They have also resisted the Amount A proposal, since the proposal states that all local taxes that have been applied will be deducted from computing Amount A. Now, the 3 countries' position is that amount A must be gross. And that actually makes sense, because if it's not gross, really, what are we going to be able to tax as developing countries? Now, what you're going to see here in terms of amount A, who does it really benefit? This data on the screen is taken from a report that was published by the South Center. And what you're basically seeing here is that the analysis suggests that for many African countries, Amount A will not generate significant tax revenues. This is when we are comparing Amount A to the UN alternative approach, like Article 12B of the UN Model Convention. Now, even if we were to reduce or to lower the revenue threshold for Amount A from 20 billion to 10 billion euros, the revenue potential for African countries may increase, but not really drastically. So from what you're seeing of the figures, we're not really going to see any sort of revenue capable of taxing at domestic developing country level. So what has been proposed are unilateral measures. And this is also because there has been a stalemate with Pillar 1. So countries have begun to adopt unilateral measures. Now, the only problem is that if Pillar 1 is to be implemented, then all unilateral measures taken by countries will have to be repealed. So generally, what we are seeing in response, right? Because we can't agree on Pillar 1, countries have begun to introduce the digital service tax, which has been implemented. In the EU, European Union, from what you are seeing on the figure here, the dark blue and golden geographical areas are European Union member states that have implemented digital service tax. Now, the golden areas have implemented the digital service tax on the condition that DST will be repealed once Pillar 1 is implemented. The countries in light blue, they have a draft DST ready for implementation, or a proposal itself is on the table. Now, if you look at Kenya, Kenya implements a 1.5% digital service tax on non-resident digital marketplaces. The good thing about DST is that it is imposed on revenue and not on income or profits, which means that even if a multinational corporation doesn't make profits, it will still pay the DST, which is a better domestic revenue mobilization approach than Amount A. Amount A, if it's implemented, it will require the repeal of digital service taxes, and countries that do not repeal the digital service tax will have to forego allocation under Amount A. And the other problem with Amount A is that it restricts the domestic revenue mobilization, is in the sense that if Amount A is implemented, the market jurisdiction is told that you should allow the multinational corporation a tax credit on all digital service taxes previously paid. So again, we're not really seeing Amount A, if it is to be implemented through a multilateral treaty, benefiting developing countries at all. So then what would be the ideal approach? Do we think about doing away with Pillar 1, or do we accept Amount A as is? Or do we really think about focusing more on unilateral measures? Now, in terms of statistics, the European Union has estimated that if they are to apply the digital service tax at 3% annually, they would generate 5 billion euros. Now, they compare this to if they are supposed to implement Amount A. Amount A would only generate 2.3 billion for the European Union. So clearly what you're seeing here is that DST is a better approach than Amount A. Now, in Kenya, we were able to collect 37.5 million US dollars by imposing a 1.5% digital service tax in 2023. If Kenya is to concede to Amount A, it means we will lose revenue from 78 multinational corporations because they will be deemed to be out of scope for Kenya to tax as per the Pillar 1 threshold. So clearly, unilateral measures have a very good advantage, but there are different African countries that have adopted, similar unilateral measures when it comes to taxing digital services. Here is what you see in Ghana, Senegal, and DRC. They have introduced the value-added tax to tax non-resident companies who are providing digital services in these countries, and the rate is between 15 and 18%. When you look at Uganda, Tanzania, Algeria, and Zimbabwe, they have introduced the digital service tax between 2 to 9%, Algeria having the highest percentage, followed by Uganda, and then Tanzania at 2%, and Kenya at 1.5%, which is the lowest. Now, These are the approaches that African countries have taken. But then the question is, when we are thinking about adopting unilateral approaches, right? What sort of digital services and digital business models should we really target? And what you're seeing here is that when we think about digital models, there are about 5 of them. We have the freemium model, the subscription model, platform-based models, e-commerce models, and data monetization models. Each one of these models provides a specific service that the multinational corporation offers developing countries. Now, if we are to tax these models, we've got to tax them on the basis of either applying a digital service tax, a value-added tax. Either we withhold the taxes or we impose levies on the number of services these digital business models provide. So what you're seeing listed here is the base that can be utilized for the purposes of introducing either of the taxes that have been mentioned, either the DST, VAT, or the levies. So we can tax digital adverts, we tax royalties from digital content, we tax software as a service, we tax in-app purchases. All these are approaches that developing countries can think about taking in order to adopt or apply their own unilateral measures going forward. So very quickly, if we are to think about moving away from the OECD and moving into the UN system, and now that we have the Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, the terms of references which were adopted, one of the early protocols to design is on ensuring the taxation of the digital economy. So what is the solution that the UN should propose? The first is, I think that the UN should think about reducing the Pillar 1 threshold. So 20 billion is high because there are lots of multinational corporations that are between 5 billion and 10 billion, and they should also be brought as part of the scope for Pillar 1. The second is that we need to think about increasing the threshold for residual profit. You can't expect developing countries as the market jurisdiction to think about sharing only 25% of residual profit. It shouldn't be the residue that remains. And then we've got to think about removing the safe harbor rules from computing this residual profit, because it reduces even the percentage that market jurisdictions can then go ahead to now extract revenue from. We've got to reject the proposal under the OECD that when it comes to estimating what amount A should be, we should remove all local taxes that have been applied. That doesn't make any logical sense. It only serves to shrink the tax base of developing countries. I think the best approach would be to introduce withholding taxes at the point of making payments. So before people make payments to these multinational corporations for the utilization of their services, they should have the right to actually withhold the taxes, because this becomes very easy to administer since it applies to the gross amount. And then we forget about applying the entire threshold of Pillar 1, because then we will have enough revenue in the country. We'll have enough revenue to be able for a country to be able to now impose its tax on. So finally, I need you to look at this particular statistics here. We've got 9.96 million Tunisian internet users, of whom 7.1 million Tunisians are on Facebook. Every 5 years, Facebook has been increasing its revenue, starting from 2010, where it generated 1.97 billion in revenue, to 2023, where it has resulted in almost 135 billion in revenue. If 7.10 million Tunisians are on Facebook, we need to have data on how much did the Tunisians help Facebook generate of the 135 billion in revenue that they actually made, and out of that, how much profit should be allocated to Tunisia for purposes of taxation. Similarly, if you look at the Google map from 2002 all the way to 2023, Google has been increasing its annual revenue. As of 2023, its revenue was 305.6 billion US dollars. If you have 9.9 million Tunisians who utilize Google, how much of their user participation generated this revenue for Google. So does Google provide country by country reporting so that the Tunisian authorities would be able to identify out of the 305 billion in revenues generated, Tunisians actually helped accumulate an X amount in this revenue, which Tunisian government can then think about imposing a tax on. So I'll stop here and then we will carry on the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lyla, for this valuable intervention. Of course, I'd like to tell you that Ms. Lyla mentioned a huge amount of reasons why we have the need now today for the taxes on digital services, especially today in these circumstances for the developed countries. It is important to talk or to tackle this problem. We have two solutions. It's either using a national tax, digital tax, and this was proved very efficient according to the presentation by Dr. Lyla, sorry. And since it has very benefits for the economy of the countries, however, we have always the gaps when it comes to dealing with the national taxes, especially with the multinational enterprises. Many details were tackled by Ms. Lyla about collaboration in order to and cooperation in order to gather more data and information in order to identify the real benefits that these enterprises raise. Dr. Lyla, I want to go back to one point that you have mentioned in one of your meetings with tax notes, and it is related to artificial intelligence and how the OECD does not consider AI, especially that a big amount or a part of the benefits of AI enterprises pass by the phase of collecting data in developing countries. So maybe, Dr. Lyla, you can share a lot of details about this topic. What do you think?
I think that's a very important question, and it's a question that disturbs many of us, because even when you look at the Pillar 1 approach, which is trying to think about how do we create new taxing rights for the digital economy, whereby the permanent establishment threshold is no longer needed, right? But when we think about artificial intelligence, the broader concept around AI is underpinned by data. Now, when you look at Pillar 1 is talking about consumer-facing businesses and automated digital services that should frame the in-scope multinational corporations that are going to be subject to Pillar 1's Amount A and Amount B. But even in the definition of digital economy, the OECD approach is not taking into account the new model that artificial intelligence is bringing about. There's so many emerging technologies that are pegged on data collection. So when we think about oil, in the Middle East and other African countries as very important for domestic revenue mobilization, the new form of oil, the new natural resource for countries today is data. So when you look at concepts, platforms like ChatGPT, right? The company that has introduced ChatGPT, Open Access, OpenAI, it's a resident of the United States, but it doesn't pay any taxes in the United States or anywhere else in the world. This company relies on us, everybody who uses ChatGPT. It relies on our power to compute that specific model by teaching it the data. This data is then utilized to now design products and services that are going to be sent out to developing countries to purchase. Now, the importance of taxing AI or even thinking about designing a digital tax strategy for artificial intelligence is by recognizing, number one, that data should be considered not only as an intangible property, but as a form of valuable property that can be subjected to taxation on the basis of certain criteria. What these criteria are, I cannot think at this particular moment, because we have to identify and say what kind of data is monetized, what kind of data is being commercialized. A lot of companies store data. The storage of that data does not necessarily result in its monetization. But if that company is now providing that data to a third company, a third party, who then utilizes or analyzes that data to generate services for a specific developing country, we need to think about what sort of a design do we create to tax that company. Because applying Pillar 1, amount A threshold, applying unilateral services like DST is not going to help, because here we're not really seeing an actual movement of data in the creation of money in the first instance. What we are seeing is that data is sold to somebody, and then somebody is thinking about, what do I do with this data to design a service? And then they design a service or they create a product. That product, when they sell, you can tax the product. But the entire data collection process, the algorithmic training around that data, and then the deployment of the app on the basis of the utilization of that data, nobody is talking about taxing it. So I really believe that AI and its major component of data, we need to think about creating a very separate tax design for this unique system that is generating a lot of products and services as passive rather than active. I hope that kind of makes sense.